Terorismul a reieșit la suprafață în Europa, iar Viena este capitala unde au avut loc cele mai recente atacuri. Liderii europeni vor să înceapă să controleze mai bine finanțările moscheilor care promovează radicalismul, iar acest lucru a dus la reacțiile violente pe care le-am văzut de curând în Franța și în Austria. Cum ajunge cineva terorist și cum se produce radicalizarea celor care ajung să provoace acte atât de oribile? Care este diferența dintre radicaliști, extremiști și extremiști violenți? Sunt doar două din întrebările la care primim răspuns de la Boaz Ganor, fondatorul Institutului Internațional de Contraterorism din Israel. Sunt Cristina Cileacu. Începe Pașaport diplomatic. Professor Boaz Ganor, founder of the International Institute of Counterterrorism, Israel, welcome to Diplomatic Passport.
Thank you for having me.
We had another attack, a terrorist attack, this time in Vienna, and the attacker was known by the authorities, but still somehow he managed to conduct this attack and to kill 4 people and wounded a couple others. Do you consider this, as a specialist in this type of work, as a failure of the agencies, of the intelligence?
Well, unfortunately, no doubt that this is a failure. I mean, this is a very clear failure altogether. What we know, at least for the time being, is that this specific person was engaged in terrorist activity, or at least tried to be engaged in terrorist activity prior to the attack. He was identified when he was trying to travel from Vienna, from Austria to Syria to become a foreign fighter, and he was stopped, and that's a success, of course. He was brought to court and he was convicted and served time in jail. He was participating in a so-called de-radicalization program, and the authorities believe that he's improving, because if they wouldn't believe that, they wouldn't let him out. He fooled them. And no doubt that he managed to prepare whatever he needed for the attack. We still don't know if this was, or at least I don't know, if this was a lone wolf attack or this was a group attack, a cell that was created in Vienna. But in both cases, it's quite clear that there was a long preparation stage. I would suggest to differ between a terrorist taking a knife and go to stab somebody, which this type of an attack doesn't have usually a radar signature, an intelligence radar signature. But when a person is purchasing and training on weapons, different types of weapons, collecting probably intelligence on potential targets and so on and so forth, that has an intelligence radar signature. So I would expect that even if he was not on the watch list, they would know something about it. Certainly, if he's on the watch list, this is something that needed to be identified and stopped before the attack occurs.
Let's get back a bit to the people, the regular people on the streets. Over this wave of terrorism we witnessed in the last, I don't know, 5 years, let's say in Europe, we saw 2 types of reaction to normal people on the streets. First of all, of course, I will remind you of the last attack in Vienna, when we saw over and over again an image of a normal person freezing, literally freezing next to a wall and being shot and killed. And another type of reaction I observed, for instance, of a Romanian baker in an attack in 2018 in London, when he simply went out and smashed a heavy object in the back of the terrorist. How can a normal people that doesn't have the training to fight against the terrorist should react?
It's a great question, Christina, and let me tell you, that we know what is preferable, and I will refer to that in a moment. But I cannot judge anybody who's freezing under this condition.
Absolutely,
it's natural. I mean, those people are not trained to neutralize an attacker, and therefore I don't put myself in a judging position. Having said that, and rightly so, you noted that there is a difference between different types of behaviors. The attack that occurred in Vienna is a little bit similar, not exactly, but there is some resemblance between this attack and the attack in Bataclan in Paris, and an attack that occurred about 5 years ago in a restaurant center in the center of Tel Aviv. In Sarona Center, that's the way, that's the place, the name of the place. And you see a different behavior of the regular passengers, or the regular people that were sitting in the restaurants in those cases. Bataclan, people freeze, people were butchered and killed, an enormous amount of people. We need to bear in mind that the attackers in Bataclan carried not just rifles and AK-47, but also bombs and suicide belts and so on and so forth, real suicide belts. But in Sarona, it was very interesting. It was also an attack in Tel Aviv, where the terrorists sat in one of the restaurants. They were having a suit and tie. It seems to be very respectable. Suddenly they stood up, took rifle and started to shoot around. Now the immediate reaction of the people that were sitting next to them was to stand and to throw on them the chairs and the tables and whatever they had in an instinct. It's not training, it's an instinct, and a good instinct. Why? Because one of them actually was mixed up from that. He had a problem with his gun. He threw his gun to the ground, and people took over him. The other one saw that and ran away, and people started to run after him. The number of casualties was quite limited, much more limited than Bataclan or even Vienna on that purpose. And that's the right behavior that can help in preventing these attacks. Again, when we are talking about those types of attacks, which are lone wolf attacks or local independent network that intelligence has a difficulty to know and to thwart before the attack occurs, the attitude, the behavior of the people in the immediate surrounding is a key factor to limit the number of casualties, the damage, and even to stop the attack.
Leaders of Europe are starting now to find new ways of fighting against radical Islam, and some proposals, first from the French President Emmanuel Macron, and another one from the Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, is to take good care of the finance of the mosques and schools that are being financed in order to produce radical Islam. But do you think, is this a good method? I mean, isn't it terrorist something that is rather linked to the underground actions?
It's a $1 million question, and probably there is no one good answer to that specific question. What do we know about terrorism? First of all, terrorism, we need to bear in mind, is a modus operandi, is a certain type of political violence. The different people use that for different purposes. And you have different waves through the history. It used to be in the past communist terrorist organizations, and then nationalist terrorist organizations. And we see extreme right-wing terrorist activity. And unfortunately, in the recent 2 decades or so, we see a lot of Islamist, jihadist activists, terrorists, which are conducting those attacks. The problem is that we need to be very careful not to throw the water of the bath with the baby. We need to bear in mind that Islam is more than 1.5 billion people altogether. So the immediate connection that some people tend to have between Islam and terrorism, this is a huge mistake, because the vast majority, by far, of the Muslims around the world are not supporting this violent activity. They do not believe in that, and definitely do not take part in that. Unfortunately, there are bad seeds that, in my view at least, misinterpret Islam. They want to show how dedicated they are to what they call genuine Islam, and they refer to everybody else as infidels, including the other Muslims, the majorities of the Muslims around the world. Those people need to be identified. Those people need to be stopped. Who can stop them? Yes, governments, intelligence agencies need to do whatever they can, but at the end of the day, the solution is in the hand of the wider crowd of the Muslims around the world, the moderate Muslims, the genuine Muslims, if you ask me. They can identify those bad seeds much better than the intelligence, much better than the police, much better than politicians, and they need to stand against them. Now, they don't need to do it in order to defend other religions, other nations. They need to do that because they need to save Islam from those Islamists that misinterpret and misuse Islam for these violent activities. How can this be done? It's a combination of activities, a combination of modus operandi. Some of it has to do with identify those ultra-extremist incitors within specific type of mosques and neutralize them by stopping their funds, by threatening them, and so on and so forth. But this is only one portion of the overall activity which is needed to be done.
Maybe you responded this question I'm going to address to you many, many times, but please do it again. Terrorists do not have a linear way of thinking. They don't rely on logic. They rely rather on theories of conspiration or something like that. Why do people become terrorists?
You don't give me easy questions in this interview, Christina.
Sorry.
Let me, actually beg to differ in the opening statement. I tend to argue that terrorists in general, and I'm generalizing here, of course there are exceptions, but terrorists in general are rational actors. Mm-hmm. What do I mean by rational actors? Those are people that identify what is the goal that they are trying to achieve. They are looking for modus operandi, for tools to achieve this goal, and they are calculating the cost and benefit of those tools, and they are choosing the modus operandi which they believe is more beneficial than costly. Most of the terrorists which I'm familiar with in the recent history are rational actors in that regard. The problem is that their calculus of cost-benefit is different than mine and different than yours and different than many of the people in the Western society. Because this calculus of cost and benefit is based on culture, is based on religious decrees, is based on set of beliefs, is based on values, it's based on interest. All of that together are being calculated in the cost-benefit analysis. One of the biggest challenge, in my view, of a counterterrorism expert, and that's what we are trying to do in ICT in Israel, in my institute, is to take out from our head our own calculus of cost-benefit, which is based on our culture, on our set of beliefs, on our values, take it away, and where the calculus of the rivalry, the calculus of Al-Qaeda, the calculus of ISIS, which is a calculus, because if there wasn't be a calculus there, if they really would be totally deranged, no rational decision, that was very bad news. What I'm saying now, it's good news, because once you understand how they calculate the cost and benefits, you potentially has the ability to think like them and therefore prevent them from doing those atrocities.
Let's speak a bit about de-radicalism, because you also teach this at your institute. So we have people that are turning radical, and then we have, even in Europe, some places where other people are trying to get out of the people's head these bad ideas. Is it easy to do something like that? Because it takes a while to become a radicalist, so how much it takes to do the other way around?
Let me be blunt in my answer. I said it in the past, so I would repeat that. I said that many years ago. I'm not a big believer in de-radicalization processes. Mm-hmm. It is very difficult. In few cases, there are success. In most cases, you don't have success. as far as I know, in de-radicalization processes. I'm a great believer in prevention of radicalism. So you can actually intervene in the education process, in prevention of incitement and so on and so forth, in order to see to it that youngsters that might have the tendency to become radicalized, to prevent them from getting there. Once a person already has been radicalized, it's difficult, almost impossible to de-radicalize him. And I think that the event in Vienna was another proof. It's not the first one. It's not the first person that was participating in de-radicalization processes and at the end of the day conducted a terrorist attack. Unfortunately, I'm afraid it's not the last one as well.
But what can you do with these people that are turning towards radicalism and stay like that?
First of all, we need to go back to the terms. Radicalism as such is not necessarily something that you can or should fight against. Let me suggest a scale of belief or beliefs in plural. We have people which are believers. They believe in that or the other thing. They believe in religion, they believe in politics, they believe in ideology. That's fine. They could be in the normal level, they could be pragmatic believers. What is a pragmatic believer? A pragmatic believer is a person who actually understands that there are others that think differently, and he accepts that. He doesn't buy the argument, but he accepts that there are others. Then you have the radicals, which is a more difficult phase than pragmatism. The radicals are strong believers, and they do not accept the other views, or the other as such, the person, the other person. But as such, they are not necessarily dangerous. The higher level than that is extremists. And the extremists are radicals that actually incite and promote and support violence in order to fulfill their beliefs. Those are dangerous people. And the highest level is the violent extremists or the terrorists, the one that take this extremism and decide to do something about it by using violence, by using terrorism altogether. So we need to find the right balance between radicalism and extremism, and that's the place we need to work on it. We, as I'm a Jew, most of your viewers are Christians, we cannot educate Muslims to be pragmatic. We hardly can educate our own people to be pragmatic. But what we can do is to explain to those societies that they need to prevent the transformation from radicalism to extremism, and definitely from extremism to terrorism. That's the business of the intelligence services, police department, and so on and so forth. But the public is very important in this fragile threshold between radicalism and extremism.
In Europe, we are very fond of human rights and the freedom of speech because this is Europe after all, and it's something that Europeans fought for many years. In Israel, the view is a bit different when it comes to terrorists. So you say, I prefer to stay alive rather than to be, let's say, correct to the others. Maybe I said it in a very simple way, but this is a basic idea. How can Europe shall manage to keep its rights, and something that is fundamental here, and also to deal with this type of attacks we see for the last 5 years at least?
First of all, as an Israeli, let me say that we identify ourselves as part of the European thinking about it. It's part of the Western thinking, and this dilemma that in the literature we call it the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism. What is the democratic dilemma in counterterrorism? How to find a fragile balance between efficiency in counterterrorism and guarding liberal democratic values at the same time. This is a challenge that Israel was facing from the day of independence in 1948 until this very moment. This is a challenge that unfortunately Europe is facing in the last decade or so, much more than it used to be in the past. This is an effort that needs to be done all the time. The baseline is the understanding that it's not the case of human rights activists versus counterterrorism experts. It's not the case. I'm a counterterrorism expert, and I refer to myself as a human rights activist as well. I believe in humanism. I believe in human rights. And I believe that the right to live is the most fundamental right of every human being. Afterwards come the right for privacy and other rights altogether, which I cherish. But don't forget that there is this right to live down there, which is the baseline for other rights that you create on top of it. The solution at the end of the day is finding the right balance based on checks and balances. You cannot let intelligence services do whatever they want in order to prevent terrorism, but you should give them enough leverage to do what is necessary to prevent terrorism. From what I'm saying, you can learn that there is no one silver bullet here that I can tell you, just adopt that and you would find a balance. It's based on the level of the threat. At times that you don't have a high level of terrorism, you can stick to much more liberal democratic values. At times that you have real threats of ongoing terrorist waves, you need to change the balance, not neglect the human rights values, God forbid, but definitely you need to adopt a different balance at that fragile time.
Professor Boaz Ganor, thank you so much for this interview. Hope to see you again in the diplomatic passport, but with different occasions perhaps.
Thank you for having me.
Atât pentru astăzi, dar rămânem în continuare online pe pagina de Facebook a emisiunii și pe contul nostru de Twitter. Revenim cu subiecte noi din lumea diplomației și a politicii externe vinerea viitoare de la 11:30 și în reluare sâmbătă de la 22:30. La revedere!